Hello, welcome again to FAIRtax Power Radio. I'm Bob Paxton.
And I'm Ron Malero.
And we are the FAIRtax Guys. We have got a treat for you today.
Yep.
We're going to get into this really quick right after we give you our email address, thefairtaxguys@gmail.com. And, of course, I invite you to like our Facebook page, leave us questions and comments there. But our CPA buddy from Colorado is back with us today.
Yeah, I'm so glad about this because, Bob and I have talked about these things before, but Jade Walle can bring to the table the perspective of a CPA. I'm not a retired CPA. Bob's not a CPA. All right. So having somebody who's a very professional CPA brings another perspective, and I think it adds to what we're talking about. This one in particular about how the fair tax helps the working poor.
Yeah, I tried to convince him to get on an airplane and fly back to Florida to talk to us again, but we had to talk to him on the phone this time. But let's dig right on in with our second interview on FAIRtax Power Radio with CPA Jade Walle. And FAIRtax Power Radio is pleased to be talking again with our Colorado CPA buddy Jade Walle. How you doing?
Hey, good, Bob. How are you?
Wonderful. Appreciate you taking time to talk to us here again.
No problem. Anytime.
All righty. Well, you sent us something here on our FAIRtax, the FAIRtaxGuys@gmail.com thing a minute ago. You wanted to explore what the fair tax would do to the working poor. And I think that would be a wonderful thing to discuss here as the tax reform debate continues throughout the nation. But right quickly, before we do that, speaking of the tax reform debate, I'd like to get your Colorado CPA's bird's eye view of the proposals that are coming out that the Republicans have put out for tax reform now. Go.
Oh, okay, Bob. Yeah, that's certainly in the news. I've thought about this a lot. I've debated with my sister-in-law the effects, and in big picture, will this help a little bit? Sure, but is it the best choice? So I think about it like this: will this bill end the $700 billion a year in illegal tax evasion?
No.
Some might say with lower rates, cheating would go down, but that's not true. Once someone's morally justified and rationalized their way into the illegalities of tax evasion, a lower rate isn't going to compel them to come clean.
Agreed.
Especially since many are likely also avoiding the self-employment tax, which is a payroll, medical, Medicare, employer and employee taxes that they often evade. I think about it like this: will the bill be revenue neutral? No, the plans are estimated to add about, I think, $1.5 trillion to the national debt over a 10-year period, these House and Senate plans. Of course, the bill's proponents believe that lower rates, especially the lower corporate tax rate of 20%, I think they'd go in 2018 for the House plan, 2019 for the Senate plan, that will stimulate the economy, which is probably true. But, Bob, which corporate tax rate do you believe would stimulate our U.S. economy more, 20% rate or the fair tax's corporate income tax rate of 0%?
I'll go with the 0 on that.
Okay.
I'd imagine most corporations would, too.
Yeah, you answered correctly in my estimation. Does this bill cease the endless class warfare that the political parties bombard each other with?
It does not.
Does it end the wasted hours of energy, effort, and congressional negotiations that will ultimately take to pass the bill into law?
No.
Does it end the $600 billion in corporate and personal costs to comply with the Internal Revenue Code spent each year, or the 8.9 billion hours of time spent complying with the code each year?
Yeah, it may reduce that a little bit, but not by a great deal.
I agree. Does this bill end the second most lobbied area on the Beltway, second only to pharmaceutical lobbying around tax code changes?
Oh, no, wait. Ron's got this right. This is the Tax Lobbyist Full Employment Act.
Exactly. I think so. Yeah, it'll flatten things out for a little bit, but then how long does that last? And you can kind of track the increase in the pages of the code from 1986 when it was flattened out to now. And so we're just, what's that definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over and over again?
And expecting a different result? Bingo, you got it.
Yeah.
I kind of thought that's what you might think of this.
Well, then I think about, does this bill end the unethical and arguably criminal exercise of IRS authority that circumvents our Constitution's Bill of Rights, including but not limited to this arcane legal concept called in rem, that a taxpayer's actual monetary funds can be guilty of a crime and therefore be able to be seized by the IRS in direct contravention of the First, Fourth, Fifth and Sixth Amendments.
Well, I don't think so, because what we're going to get, in order to combat the evasion, they're going to have to beef up the IRS and do more of this.
That's exactly right.
So I don't think this is the answer at all, and I'm glad you agree with us here.
Absolutely. I would say this bill, as you and Ron have eloquently stated in past episodes, is a beautiful and proper exercise in rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic.
Mm-hmm. And a great Christmas present for the tax lobbyists, no doubt about it.
Absolutely.
All right.
Go ahead, Paul.
I was just saying, let's shift gears and get on to what we really wanted to talk about. And you have done a good bit of research on the fair tax's impact on the working poor. And it's, just as sure as death and anything else, that as soon as we have a tax reform debate, one side of the aisle is going to say whatever the other side wants is tax reform for the rich, and the poor get screwed. How does the fair tax work, in your opinion, for the working poor?
Yeah, good question. I really have examined this a lot, and this is one thing I love about the fair tax, because if we think back, even in the Bible, Jesus said that the poor would always be with us.
Yes, he
did. But
did.
He didn't say how many and what percentage of the population would be poor. So I think there are things we can do. Ultimately, individuals have to take actions as well, but what could we do from a tax system perspective to make it easier to bridge that gap and get out of that conundrum, that melee of being in the working poor? And so I've got a few points that I wanted to cover with you today.
Take off.
Yeah, the first starts with less taxes paid by the working poor. And so the fair tax, when you actually look at it, even though it's a single rate for people to spend at the retail level for new goods and services, even though it's a flat rate, it actually ends up being a more progressive tax system than the income tax rate. And on the surface, you might question that, but it's actually true. There's a 2006 PhD study that found that low-income households would experience 5 times the increase in benefits relative to high-income households under the fair tax relative to the income tax. And in this study, the fair tax was found to actually be more progressive than the income and payroll tax system. And there's a few stats here. I know this is radio, so I'll keep it brief. But if you were around in a 2-child household, around $20,000 of income, so arguably in the working poor bucket, you would experience a 67% drop in your lifetime rates under the fair tax relative to the income tax. 67% drop. If you were in the $30,000 income bucket, you would experience a 60% drop, lifetime rates, fair tax versus income tax. Now, in the $100,000 income person, they would fare better under the fair tax as well, but they'd only have a 34% drop in lifetime income tax rates, fair tax versus income tax. So not as good as the working poor. And really what drives this is the regressive payroll tax. So
that's what I was going to ask you. Does that study include the payroll tax, which is the most regressive tax on the books?
It does. It does. And so when you might say, well, Jade, how can a 39.6% top income tax rate, how can that not be more progressive, compared to a 0% or 10% rate currently under the income tax code? How can that not be more progressive? And the answer is that payroll tax. That payroll tax is the most regressive and the most burdensome on the working poor. Because if you think about it, it's almost 10% of your paycheck. If you're bringing home 20 or 30,000 and trying to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and get out of that poverty cycle, you're having almost 10% of your labor and your earnings taken right off the bat. So that really plays into those statistics.
Yeah, you don't get that back. Stuff that's federal withholding from your paycheck, you can get that back if your income's low enough with your tax refund every year, but you don't get those payroll taxes back ever. That's gone.
That's right. So former U.S. Secretary of Labor Robert Reich said, quote, "Everyone hates taxes, but the payroll tax has got to be the worst. 4 out of 5 American workers pay more in payroll taxes than they do in income tax."
Oh, that doesn't surprise me at all.
And then he finishes by saying the payroll tax is also regressive as, and I won't say the word, H-E-double hockey sticks, and then he says poorer workers pay proportionally more than richer ones, end quote. And that's from the last decade. So I think that sums it up.
I think that's pretty good.
Also, Bob, we think about how does the fair tax affect some of your largest lifetime expenditures. So arguably, if you and I are working and scraping to get by, two of our largest expenditures are probably a home and on an auto for transportation.
Yeah, buying a house and buying a car.
You got it. And if I'm in the working poor bucket, guess what I can do with the FAIRtax? Because already 80% of homes purchased are not new; they're used, and quite a bit of cars are used as well. And you can basically avoid some of your largest lifetime tax expenditures on new homes and new autos simply by buying used, which a lot of us do already anyway, and really even lower that rate even more as a working poor American.
I imagine that's something that folks haven't really sunk into yet. They think sales taxes apply to everything. But the FAIRtax, as you know, does have this cutout. You do not pay the FAIRtax on any used item because everything is only going to be taxed once to the person who purchased it new, and that includes big-ticket items like houses.
Yep, spot on. The other thing, if we're thinking about how can someone really escape poverty, well, if you kept your entire paycheck, again, with those payroll taxes and federal taxes not being withheld, you're going to have more cash in your pocket, more ability to save, and to potentially escape poverty.
And talking about escaping poverty, what is the biggest ticket to doing that? Education.
Oh, yes, absolutely. That's one of the key points I wanted to hit on here, Bob.
I wanted to lead you right into it.
Nice setup. The FAIRtax completely untaxes education. And you think about that now, and you're like, well, I don't pay a sales tax on education, but every tuition check you write for your son or your daughter, et cetera, or you might write for yourself, if you're already an adult and you're trying to get out of that cycle of poverty, every dollar you spend is after-tax dollars currently. Under the FAIRtax, every dollar you spend is pre-tax dollars because there is no income tax. And remember, education is the absolute key to escaping poverty in whatever country, whatever lifetime we're in. Those that are educated have a much, much better chance of having, jobs, careers, etc., that allow them to escape that horrible cycle of poverty. Mm-hmm. Also, as you pointed out on previous episodes, education is considered. It's one of the rare asterisks in the FAIRtax Act. Is one of the rare, what I'll call exceptions. But the FAIRtax authors consider education and tuition as an investment in yourself. And as you know, the FAIRtax doesn't tax investments. It encourages investments because they're tax-free. You only get taxed on consumption. And so the FAIRtax considers education to be an investment in yourself. And so when you write that tuition check to the University of North Carolina, you are not paying the FAIRtax on that consumption, even though you're consuming education. So that really makes education one of the most important and opportunistic things to spend your money on. It actually encourages education, which will, by default, encourage and help so many people escape poverty.
Amen. And something else that would help people escape poverty is just more jobs in America.
Absolutely. So this is what I love about the FAIRtax. So currently, our income tax favors exporting jobs and importing goods. The FAIRtax stops this. There's currently a 17% disadvantage that U.S.-made goods have relative to the foreign-made goods imported into the U.S. Because again, a lot of those other countries they'll get their taxes refunded, their VAT taxes refunded by their governments before they're sold to us. We don't have that. All those embedded taxes that are built up into the cost of every widget we make in America, those don't get refunded back. And so we're at this perpetual disadvantage relative to the other countries. And so the FAIRtax gets rid of that, because if you sell your U.S.-made goods abroad, first of all, you're not going to pay embedded taxes along the way, so the prices will be cheaper. And you don't have to charge the FAIRtax if you're selling outside the U.S. So it's really going to stop the job exports and bring in better-paying jobs into the U.S.
All right. Now, I tell you what, I'm saving one of the biggies for later on here, but I want to hit on the prebate is what I'm really getting at. If you want to help the working poor, give them a tax refund every month.
Absolutely. So, great point. So, basically, the FAIRtax completely untaxes the working poor with the prebate. So when I think the current 2017 rate for a family of four, the poverty level by the DHHS, published each year, is $32,480 or something like that. So the tax at a 23% inclusive rate on that was something like $600 a month. You would get a tax credit prebate at the beginning of each month, comes out to like $7,000 something a year, that you basically get a refund for all the tax you're going to pay on those basic necessities of life up to the poverty level. So if you think about that, if I'm making and spending $32,480 a year, I am not going to buy all new goods with that money. Maybe that auto or that home, etc. So I'm not even going to expend that much on fair tax, but I'm going to get all of that fair tax back. So I actually end up paying a negative tax rate. It's actually like, it's akin to a tax credit or an earned income credit under the current system.
Those refundable credits that you don't pay tax, but you get a refund on it like they have now. Fair tax does that. All you got to do is keep your spending under the poverty level, and it's automatic.
Absolutely. So that means, as working poor, you will never pay a dime of income tax on a basic necessity of life. Right now, those working poor, 10%, almost 10% rounded up, is immediately taken from their paycheck, which signifies that the government believes that working poor person has a greater obligation to fund the government before they have an obligation to feed and fund their family.
Oh, that has aggravated me for a long time on that. When the government sets itself up as everyone's highest spending priority, including the working poor. You will pay me before you spend a dime on your family because I get mine off the top. That needs to go away really bad.
Absolutely. It's not right. And so anyone, I think on any side of the aisle, Bob, who could say that that's a good thing that we just take 10% off the top from the working poor's paycheck? That doesn't make any sense.
It makes no sense at all. We got about 10 minutes to go here. What else have you dug up for us?
Okay. So another thing, we talked about this a couple episodes ago about how the fair tax taxes existing wealth. Well, this allows the fruits of the working poor's labor and savings, for many their only meaningful way to escape poverty, to be incentivized further. So because there's no taxation on your labor or your savings and investment. So all these keys to getting out of poverty, they're encouraged, not discouraged through future taxation. I like that.
Oh, yeah. And the income tax is just the other way around. It discourages the things that people need to do to get out of poverty.
Exactly. Let's talk about the economy boost.
Go for it.
The fair tax effect on the economy, you've got, we talk about GDP, real wage, and purchasing power growth. And this is growth compared, so let's think about growth compared if we have an economy that's growing versus economies that have recessions that seem to happen every 5, 10, 12 years. So with economies that have recessions, what happens with our working poor? The recessions hit the working poor disproportionately hard.
Yeah, they're the first ones to get laid off.
Yes, many lower wage jobs are the first to go in a down economic cycle, and the working poor don't often have the resources to weather these bad times. And so let me give you some stats on what the fair tax will do to the economy and how we'll have less of these recessions. So Beacon Hill Institute predicts that real GDP would be 10% higher in just 4 years under the fair tax. Some other studies say that's about 10 years, but Beacon Hill Institute says in 4 years you have GDP 10% growth. That's unheard of. They're happy right now if they can get to 2 to 3%.
Yeah, that's rocket fuel for the economy.
Rocket fuel. So also study, Dr. Lawrence Kotlikoff, PhD, study found that real wages would be 11.5% higher in 2030. And I know this will make you feel not young.
Well, I'm already old and retired. There's not much more you can do to me.
Well, that's only 13 years away is what I was going to say, which is kind of, wow, that's kind of like a glass of water in the face. But by 2030, you'd have 11.5% higher wages relative to if we stay under the income tax found in this PhD study. That's rocket fuel for escaping poverty as well.
Why are the politicians not looking at this?
Oh, you know what? I think we get caught up in this. Well, it just can't be done. I understand Steve Hayes has talked to Speaker Ryan, and I think Speaker Ryan doesn't deny that the fair tax is a good system. He just thinks it'd be too hard. But you know what I say to that, Bob, and everyone who gives me that line? I say, well, going to the moon was probably going to be really hard to accomplish in the 60s. In the 19-teens, I bet it was a really hard prospect that women would be able to vote in the 1920s. Can you imagine the resistance? And you know what? What if people have just said, you know what, that's just going to be too hard. Let's just drop it.
Yeah.
Where would we be? So I don't buy that.
Back in the 19-teens.
Yeah. Another thing, Bob, I know we just have a few minutes here. Charitable giving. Let's face it, charitable giving through churches and nonprofits, that helps quite a bit when we think about some folks in some programs that actually help people in career training and pick themselves up and get out of these horrible cycles of poverty. Guess what happens under the fair tax? You might think, well, hey, there's no charitable deduction, so wouldn't charitable giving go down? Not the case. Not the case. So if we look at the tax rates in the late 70s under Carter, in the early 80s, the marginal rate was like, I don't know, 70, 80, 90%. So that charitable deduction was worth a ton back then because you get to shield income from a 80% taxation rate. But guess what happened after the 1988 changes and all those changes to the code and lowered the rate, meaning your charitable deduction shielded less income from taxation? Guess what happened? You think charitable giving would go down? It actually went up, and it went up in spades. And what the studies ultimately found was when you've got money in your pocket, when you've got your whole paycheck in your pocket, the American people are the most generous in giving on the face of the planet. And when you are keeping more of your money and your purchasing power goes up under the fair tax, charitable giving is projected to go up quite a bit.
Oh, no doubt about it. People believe in the cause. That's why they give to their church. That's why they give to the Red Cross. That's why they give to whatever charity that they like to do. Very few people, I mean, if you're up on the higher income level and you're looking to shield income, you're looking for, a way to reduce your taxes, that's one way to do it. Most people that are charitable giving don't think of that at all.
That's right. And only 30% of people currently itemize to even get a charitable contribution deduction.
And if this doubling of the standard deduction goes through, then that's going to be even less.
That's right. That's right. Another thing, Bob, Social Security is shored up with a $9 trillion consumption tax base compared to a $5 trillion income tax base. You have a more stable base for Social Security to last beyond 2033, the year it's currently projected to go defunct. Mm-hmm. So, and by the way, Social Security and Medicare, those are important safety nets for many of us. And so that actually gets shored up under the fair tax.
All right. We've got about 3 or 4 minutes left. Anything left on your bullet list you want to get to?
Yeah. So let's think about evasion. Evasion is 25 trending up to 30%. Guess what happens under the fair tax? We have a 90% reduction in the number of filers. And as U.S. citizens, as the working poor, we can concentrate on improving our individual position and circumstances for the better, which is the essence of the American dream, instead of messing with tax code, tax reform, lamenting about my payroll taxes being taken from me, etc. Also, Bob, goods and services, they're cheaper. The Harvard's economics department studies from about a decade ago show on average goods would go down, depending on the industry, 22%. And that would manifest itself in either lower cost items or higher wages, more dividends and distributions, or more R&D in companies. But in general, prices are going to go down. And even if prices rise with the fair tax's inclusion in the price, and I've heard worst case scenarios in the 8 to 13% raise, your purchasing power, the studies prove, are still dramatically increased under the fair tax relative to the income tax. And so if your purchasing power is more, that means you've got more money in your pocket to escape poverty.
So it is your CPA's professional opinion that the fair tax is the best way to go for the working poor?
I think it makes a dramatic difference, and it makes a meaningful difference to help so many people get out of the cycle. Now, will some remain in the cycle? Sure. But is it at least a system that will encourage getting up out of that melee? Yes, it is.
All right. Well, I certainly appreciate you taking time to talk to us again today. Who knows? We may be back at you a bit later on a future episode.
Happy to, Bob. Good talking to you.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay, and as always, our buddy Jade came up with some pretty good stuff here.
Yeah, I was expecting a very good interview, and I was not disappointed.
I'll tell you what, he digs into the facts and figures, no doubt about it. We've talked about a lot of the stuff that he covered earlier on FAIRtax Power Radio. It's just the basics of the fair tax, but when you put the facts and figures and present it from a CPA's view, it almost sounds entirely different, but it's right on target.
Yep. The man has done his homework. I mean, considering that he only discovered the FAIRtax sometime this year, earlier this year. And I consider him an expert because he's done so much background work. So, yeah.
Okay.
Let's see.
One thing he said that leaped out at me real quickly was the concept, I forget what he said the legal name of it was, but it's the concept that somebody's money is actually capable of committing a crime and letting the IRS take it.
Yes, and I remember...
You're not carrying any outlaw dollar bills in your pocket, are you?
I remember reading about that in preparation for one of our episodes where we were talking about civil asset forfeiture. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's part of that, and it's a strange legal concept. CPAs and lawyers understand it, but to the rest of it sounds strange.
CPA and lawyers remember the name of it, but we don't.
Yeah, but what a weird thing. Your money can be considered a criminal. It's just...
Yeah, not you. Your money can be guilty of a crime.
Yep. So.
Oh, well. Go ahead.
But he talked about the current tax plan that's being proposed by the House. He brought up a number of problems with it, just like Bob and I have. But he also had a lot of details about how the FAIRtax will help the working poor. This was very good because this is a very important concept. The knee-jerk reaction on the part of some people, the FAIRtax, that's a sales tax. That'll hurt the poor. They don't know what they're talking about.
No, I'll tell you what, taking the withholding out of your paycheck, taking the federal payroll taxes away, let you bring home the full amount of your paycheck, plus get the prebate every month, that is a godsend for lower-end people.
Absolutely. Everybody will have more spending power, more
purchasing power.
Thank you. Purchasing power.
No problem.
Which we have talked about before, and he backed it up with some facts and figures here. So yes, everybody will have, but it really helps the poor.
Yeah, and the point about education, the best ticket out of poverty in the world is education, and the FAIRtax does not tax that. It considers that an investment in yourself.
And that's a great way of looking at it. One that being a former teacher, that I'm. Much to my chagrin, I hadn't thought of that, but yeah, he's absolutely right. So and let's see, it's going to boost the economy, so it creates more jobs, and the more jobs, the better. All right, especially if you have a lot of jobs and not a lot of people filling those jobs, that's very good for the workers. Yeah, it increases wages.
That puts upward pressure on wages for sure.
And, so. I'm looking through the notes here because he covered a lot of ground here. And goods and services are yes, I mentioned that, are cheaper, and therefore you have greater purchasing power. Evasion is a huge problem that hurts everybody, and the people at the lower end of the scale, when there's a recession, those are the people who get hurt first.
Yeah, and again, he made the point that the working poor can avoid the FAIRtax. That's legal. On their two biggest purchases, a house and a car. You can buy used, no FAIRtax on used items.
That's right. That's a huge benefit to them. If you're just getting by and you can buy a house or a car and you don't have, and it's used, so therefore there's no FAIRtax on it.
The original purchaser paid the FAIRtax. Everything's only taxed once.
Yep. So
all right. Well, we're about out of time. A lot of time flies when you're having a lot of fun.
Yeah.
But again, we remind folks to get in touch with us at thefairtaxguys@gmail.com. We will be having another Facebook Live. We're probably going to take December off for the holidays and stuff, and we'll probably be back in January with Facebook Live.
Yeah, we'll see.
We will do that, but we'll announce that on our Facebook page and invite you to check that out. Leave us a comment if you will. And that is going to just about wrap it up. Got about 15 seconds for your last final point. Go.
Okay, don't forget, don't keep this a secret. FAIRtax Power Radio is for everybody, and we need to educate as many people in the country about FAIRtax if we're going to get this done. So tell everybody you know about this free podcast and the free apps for both iPhone and Android.
Okay, thanks again, Jade, for talking to us. We will be back at you. I can guarantee you that. But until next time, I'm Bob Paxton.
And I'm Ron Malero.
We are the FAIRtax Guys, reminding you again that the FAIRtax is America's big solution, and once you understand it,
you'll demand it.
FAIRtax is coming.